Well, we are back. Thank you very much for staying with Metropol Debrief. I'm Andira Ganga, and when we sit down, it's time for the conversation. Joining me in studio, Kwame Owino, who's the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Kwame, thank you for making time. And you are asking if anyone watches business at this hour. You know, job cuts are happening, so people are following business trends just to know, am I next or not?
Okay, that's good to hear.
Good to hear. Let's start with that.
Yes.
Job cuts are happening.
Yes.
Layoffs are all over the place. However, this is nothing new. It's been happening.
Yes.
Why are we beginning to take notice of it right now?
Okay, I mean, to be honest, any vibrant economy, or rather any economy, has what an economist calls job churn, which is some people are leaving jobs and joining others, and other new jobs are being created. So this change on its own, that some firms, which might either be closing or stepping down or changing the nature of their business, is normal, and it happens throughout. I think what concerns us about Kenya today is that just that job cuts are being announced at the same time as we've had many companies, and especially the more stable, more formal companies, announcing profit warnings. So when those two come together, it's clear that many companies, especially those in the formal sector, are under serious business pressure. And because of that, they're having to make adjustments, because nobody likes to let their employees whom they invested in and have created some capabilities on to actually just leave. So I think it's the convergence of those two profit warnings that have been coming in over the last 1 year, and at the same time now we have many more job cuts in sectors all the way from banking, I mean telecommunications, even in agriculture companies. So that's worrying.
And you've mentioned that this is an ordinary trend in any given economy.
Yes.
Some jobs will shut down and new ones will come in.
Yes.
However, is that the matrix that the Kenyan economy operates in, or if it's just job cuts, it's job cuts across the whole board? Are we creating jobs that can cushion the economy from the job losses that we're experiencing now?
No, certainly not in the formal sector for those with wages. If you have your main biggest companies, whether those that are not only those that are quoted in the Securities Exchange, but you have many other firms, that some of the biggest manufacturing firms, whether the construction of cement, manufacturing of cement and in manufacturing in general, if those firms are actually laying off people, then obviously the multiplier effect itself would be large, but it's also telling you that something really big. I think many companies are facing difficult moments.
And you speak of difficult moments and business pressure.
Yes.
What could be causing this kind of pressure?
Well, I think if economic activity is slowing down, of course, if you read government's GDP numbers, it's telling you that economic growth is taking place. I think gross domestic product
the GDP was
growing. Yes. But at the same time, companies have not had sales. So if you saw, some of them had poor sales right from Christmas into this new year. Of course, the banks, some of the banks have recovered. But the business environment is changing for many more of them. At the same time, if you look at the exports, not been growing as fast as is possible. So all these other things, some of them are obviously domestic as well. I think the burdens of businesses are much higher. Incomes among people have not been growing. Actually, in the formal sector, incomes have not been growing. So because incomes have not been growing, it means people's buying power has also not improved. So for that reason, businesses cannot expand. And if they cannot expand, they have to be careful about not taking new costs with them. And that might involve, the easiest things to actually adjust in a business is actually to cut back on labor, because labor is a fixed cost. You have to pay people wages every month. So the moment a business has seen 1 quarter or 2 quarters in which there's soft demand for their products, then obviously they make this difficult choice.
However, if that's the case in the formal sector, then how does it, what does it reflect on the informal sector, or how does it play out in the informal sector? Because formal sector is kind of well arranged, it's streamlined, you can go to the bank, you can get credit, there are proper lines of doing business. How about those in the informal sector? What's their state currently?
Well, I think the informal sector actually is more, one of the things, the distinctions between the formal and the informal. So the definition that I adopt is the formal sector as people who actually receive a wage on a regular basis. So you're paid at the end of the month and all that. The informal sector actually are people who run businesses. Some of them might be small. It might be one person employing themselves, and it might also be seasonal. So for instance, somebody does farming for the first few months of the year when there are the rains. The next few months they're trading what they got. And then, of course, in the final ones, they're trying to make do as they prepare for the new rainy season. So those ones actually change even much faster. And no one necessarily measures them, but they have a very seasonal character, and I think that's what's happening. Now here, the problem with this, the formal sector changes, which is what we have been announced, whether it's the telecoms companies or all that, that tends to mean is these are people who've already had a regular wage, and now, because of the nature of business or whatever it is that provides that pressure, it makes it necessary for people who've been working regularly to actually be asked to leave. That usually is not an easy adjustment unless they can find another job somewhere else.
Of which is also something we'll discuss, finding another job after you've been laid off. However, I want us to talk in detail about some of these things that are pushing businesses into trying to cut down their cost and expenditure. And the first one I want us to talk about is, one, fiscal policy and fiscal governance, and just the budgets within an organization or a business. We saw it with East Africa Portlands Limited, where the previous year, they had more employees, but spent less paying their employees. The next financial year, they had less employees, but they spent more. And we saw they said they rendered all positions redundant in the first place. Then they withdrew that, and they were asking for government help. And the government really did come to intervene, but this is what the government had to say. The Cabinet Secretary Industrialization, Peter Munya, held a press briefing, and this is what he had to say on the government's intervention in helping the East African Portland Cement Limited. Listening. The salaries that the people who are working at East African Portlands is not comparable to their peers in the market. So it looks like numbers were doctors here and there to favor a few for a certain period of time, and then the business now cannot sustain itself. And when the business cannot sustain itself, it cannot sustain you.
Well, I think that's it's a completely different one. I mean, there are farms that receive pressure. That have competition and pressure. But remember, this is a farm that is actually partly owned by government. So government decision, so it's like a parastatal. And Kenyan parastatals have that problem.
Yeah.
So here is a farm that is leaking a lot of money. I think part of the statement said that they were losing 8 million shillings per day. So if you're making a loss of 8 million shillings a day, and your employees are some of the highest paid people in Kenya, that's a management problem. So it's a instead of even blaming the business conditions, it's actually management competence that is questions. Why are you employing people twice as much as you need and paying them wages that are premium above what the market would provide, and yet you're losing money? So this is a government problem, and for a long time, part of it is also political pressure. That jobs should not be allowed to go, and even while they announced, they had to take back that because there was pressure for them to continue to keep. It's just that this is a company that's suffering not necessarily for any external reasons. It's largely internal. Its managers have not been prudent.
Now, also Stanbic said they were offering voluntary retirement to some of their employees, and they were saying they're just trying to cut down on cost, improve efficiency, and also because of the new digital wave, right? We're living in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, robotics. So they just want to ensure that they are well placed to be competitive in the new wave of the market. Let's listen into what their CEO had to say, and then we can come back and discuss that. Technology is here and it's here to stay. And it's disrupting jobs, not just in this country and this continent, but in the whole of the world. How do we ensure we are not caught by surprise moving forward?
Well, I don't think there's much you can do about it. You see, businesses compete with each other, and there are some businesses, especially in the banking and financial services industry, it's a very capital intensive industry. And so to the extent that they can, they try to make sure that they can compete. Technology provides a competitive edge for your competitors, then you have to adjust. I think the good thing that they've done is that they're allowing for voluntary retirement. So those who wish to change careers or those who see the possibility of redundancy are being paid, and that's a good thing.
Yes.
The other thing is that if you have a very rigid labor force, based on the fact that if you look at the findings and generally the decisions by the industrial courts in Kenya, the decisions of the industrial courts in Kenya tend to favor workers. Maybe that's not a bad thing, but the cost we pay for that is that businesses are reluctant to hire people for the long term.
Okay.
Because getting rid of them would be very, very difficult and stuff like that.
And also expensive.
And expensive,
Yeah.
precisely. So I think that's the one thing. What do we do? Well, if a business is prepared to give an incentive for somebody to retire, to voluntarily retire, I think that's a good thing because this person can take this, upskill, or start their own business, but more often than not, acquire new skills and then go ahead with that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think what we need to ask ourselves is, if every business is laying off workers at the same time, then that's not a specific business issue. It's actually the overall economy. And I think there's some things that the national government has not done well, including just the burden of business. Taxes, to be honest, compared to our neighbors, are some of the highest. So obviously, as the world opens up, you're facing competition globally or even here, the best way to actually make sure that your margins are decent is to reduce labor costs, because labor costs tend to stick for a long time.
And I think that's the place where Ethiopia is beating us at, because people who have gone to invest in Ethiopia say, as much as there are some things that might be really good in Kenya, labor cost in Ethiopia is effective for business because you can make profits. Labor is cheap, same to Rwanda.
Oh, well, yes. I am reluctant to compare labor costs one for one between Kenya and Ethiopia for reasons that are different. But I think the first thing that we also have to be clear about is, yes, Kenyan labor costs are high. It's not always because, sometimes it's also because we have a far better, more productive labor than other parts of our neighborhood.
Yes.
But the main one is that we are a high cost destination. Whether it's, you think about transportation costs, energy costs, food, which is important for people who work and all that, generally very expensive. Again, because of the decisions the government has made. So
like
for instance,
decisions?
Well, if you're supporting an industry to produce food industry, say, for instance, cereals, right? Which is what, and Kenyans spend 40% of their household budgets to buy food. If your food is expensive, it means your labor costs will in turn be expensive. And who makes that food expensive and sugar and everything else expensive? Government. Why? Because it's running inefficient companies, including the one we've just talked about. If you're going to sell cement in the market from the most expensive labor, it means your cement is going to be among the most expensive. So you're adding to the costs of everybody else by not making businesses. Some of these businesses should be allowed to compete, and those that cannot compete should just be allowed to close. It's not a bad thing for the overall economy, even if it might be for a few workers here and there.
Why does the government keep saying we are doing well in the World Global Ease of Doing Business Index, yet the situation on the ground kind of does not reflect that?
Well, I think that's a clear one. I think the effort that government has made in terms of bringing down Kenya's ranking in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business is commendable in the sense that, I think we improved over the space of 3 years almost 40 or 50 positions. That's okay. The unfortunate thing is that alone does not ensure that you get new investment and does not. So you may make it easier for businesses to register, because most of this is about registration, getting new license plates and license conditions and everything else. But if Kenyan businesses are facing conditions where, for instance, you have a power company that is a monopoly distributor, right? And its workers are colluding to make power more expensive for people, then obviously those are internal things, and that might not be reflected in your ease of doing business, but it affects business people all around. Because the cost of production will shoot up, and obviously. I think the cost of energy is one of the reasons why many investors are shying away from Kenya. Cadbury shut down and went to operate in Egypt. Well, some businesses are very highly sensitive to the cost of energy, but in my view, it's not just a reflection of that. It's a reflection of, remember, the power company itself is also government owned, or largely government owned as well. So when you have public sector institutions in which integrity in its management is lacking and they're so critical to the performance of other sectors, then obviously that shows up. Even if your ranking in the ease of doing business improves by 60 points, by 60 spaces as much as Kenya's has. Yep.
There are other companies in this country that are ailing. They're not doing well.
Yes.
They might not have laid off their workers, but they've issued profit warnings,
Yeah.
and maybe they might be heading there.
Yeah.
Is there a turnaround gear that these companies can adopt before they get there?
Well, I think every company has its own, and their managers know what the pressure points are. So obviously, part of the dialogue with government is important. But the most important point is, this is where you need to see business lobbies come up with something more special than simply asking for your everyday business as usual, which is basically power costs and energy costs. There's something certainly about the structure of business in this country that tells you that many more businesses are in trouble, but even the ones that are there are not growing, just managing, because without business growth, there's no way you're going to create employment. So if these businesses are successful, but they're not growing, we must ask ourselves why. And some of it is just constraints. There's no reason to expand if land costs are expensive, water does not come in. It's an evening in Nairobi right now, and right in the city center, it's dark.
Yes.
People are walking around here using their phones, their touch, the lights from their phones to see their way right in the city center. Something is wrong, and that's not something that might be reflected in the ease of doing business, because it looks at certainly different things. But your business people tell you, look, this is not an environment that's useful for conducting business.
What do you think will take for the government to see that there's a problem and start fixing it?
I don't know. It's not a single thing, but I think the first one is the government of Kenya is obsessed with borrowing money and building big infrastructure. So obviously those infrastructure investments have not gone in. Part of that has meant, and part of one of the businesses mentioned it, is that they're displaced. Government is borrowing too much money and displacing private and medium-sized businesses from borrowing.
Yes.
So because of that, they can't make new investments. If they cannot grow, it's likely they also will not hire new people, because they're not sure about the terms. So looking at our taxes on the other side, but also the heavy borrowing that government does, and how government spends money. So government is the biggest buyer. It buys very inefficient services. Of course, once in a while a dam is supposed to be constructed, except we don't see it.
Well, 21 billion shillings later.
Yeah.
Okay, now, this is not just a Kenyan problem. It's happening even on the global front. What's the difference between the situation in the US, Canada, UK, and Kenya?
Very different conditions. So for instance, in places like the US, fine, they have a big deficit as well, but the government of the US is borrowing money at less than 2% for a 10-year bond.
2%?
Yes.
And Kenya is borrowing at 7 years, and the percentages are about 12 and 15%.
Well, about 8, 9 or thereabouts, slightly less. But basically what that tells you obviously is government is loading a lot of debt on public expenditure. So that's a first. The second is, of course, there's a World Bank measure called the CPI, which basically measures how the effectiveness of government spending. So these government spends, so I keep mentioning this, and then we had the budget, or rather the formal presentation of the budget to Parliament about 5-6 weeks ago,
Yes.
at which the Cabinet Secretary said our total spending will be between 29 to $30 billion for the whole year. Now that means
That's about
spending,
3 trillion Kenya shillings?
yes, 3 trillion Kenya shillings, and that's more than Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda,
All
and
put
Burundi
together?
And yet when you look at our outcomes in terms of public sector effectiveness, we are not far above most of them, and actually some governments such as Rwanda are more effective than the government of Kenya. So it tells you a lot of money is being taken in taxes and just completely wasted.
Why are we spending more than we are making, and we are making more than enough to sustain ourselves?
Well, I think it's
because the budget, recurrent expenditure was about 1.7 trillion Kenya shillings. KRA raises about 1.2 to 1.5 trillion Kenya shillings.
Well, there is 1.5 this year. Yes.
Yes. And then there's that budget deficit that you have to borrow to fund.
Yes.
Yet if you took care of recurrent expenditure, then whatever you raised would be more than enough to sustain yourself.
Well, it's just waste. I think there's a lot of public waste of public spending. I mean, whether it's you have a lease of equipment, the Auditor General states it in every budget season.
Yes.
Remember, every time government is wasting money, it means that's not money that's available to the public, to the private sector, for instance, to actually invest and get a return from, which might create jobs. Or it means the quality of public services, which even businesses rely on and the population relies on, will not be as effective as it is. So that's it. A government that is efficient at collecting money, efficient at borrowing more, and wasting both.
Well, Kwame, right there, the government is efficient at collecting, efficient at borrowing, and equally efficient at wasting so much more than it has. We went to the streets and we had a conversation with you, and we wanted to know what you make out of this whole topic. Kwame has his views, but let's listen into what you had to say. Well, what is the fate of those who are losing their jobs? And now nobody knows if they're safe or not. So, one, is the Kenyan economy or the job market ready to absorb those who have been let go? And if not, what is their fate?
Well, I think Kenyans, people who lose jobs are anxious because obviously, if it's tightening as much as it is, it's not easy for somebody to get a job. Sometimes it takes much longer. Other times, people decide to, give up and actually choose other businesses, going to other businesses.
Yes.
So in general, for someone to have lost a job, if you've dedicated yourself, you're planning with the kind of job you have other liabilities based on the job that you have, it's sad when someone has lost their jobs. But it's not something that one person can fix or any one company. Remember, while the government of Kenya, of course, is a big employer, as a single employer, but most of Kenyans are actually employed outside government.
Yes.
So that means that those businesses must grow and absorb many more people because government cannot be our last resort employer anymore.
So we will keep going back to the whole circle and circle, because if you lose your job with one business entity, it's another business entity that will have to absorb you.
Yes.
So one way or the other, the business environment has to be right, for jobs to be created in the country.
Certainly.
One gentleman said economic stimulus, just like President Mwai Kibaki did.
Yes.
Is that a viable option?
No. An economic stimulus works in very specific circumstances.
Like which ones?
Well, if you have, mainstream economics says that if you have a situation in which there's a recession. And a recession is where the economy is not growing. In our case, at least the nominal numbers that are given to us show that we are growing at about 6%. So it's not about a stimulus. In those circumstances, you'll be wasting money by taking it again from the private sector. In our view, in fact, right now, the government of Kenya is taking too much money off the markets that would be used by other farms to grow. So that's the first one. So I think an economic stimulus, this is not the situation for an economic stimulus. It would actually waste a lot of public money. Yeah.
Finally, before we wind up this segment and then we can go to social media, what are some of the 3 things, or rather 5, that the government should prioritize moving forward? Because this is a looming crisis. The government is the biggest employer as a single entity, but it cannot employ all Kenyans.
Yes.
It's packed to capacity. The government does not fire people. You have to die or retire for it to have room to absorb another person. So if the Jubilee administration is staying true to its word of creating jobs, and they were elected under the banner that they were young people, and it's the young people who are being churned out as graduates every single year with no jobs. Jobs have to be created. So what are some of the things that they need to rectify in the market and in the economy to ensure they restore stability?
Okay, I think the first one is basically the government needs to switch back on the privatization engine. We have a good privatization policy. We have a privatization commission, but it's been starved of work. Partly for the same reason, that many people, some of them are actually cabinet secretaries, do not want farms privatized because they lose the influence in terms of sitting on boards or even making decisions on behalf of that. So the privatization of industries in which government is involved would be useful. And we at the Institute of Economic Affairs have been trying to, because we track on privatization, have been trying to put together a list of companies in which the government has some kind of holding or the other, or an interest, one way or the other, and there are more than 300.
And some of those companies?
Well, and they're all not doing well. So the point is, why are we keeping government money in institutions that are not performing? So either you privatize them, or those that are completely cannot run should be closed down.
Mumias Sugar?
Obviously. There's no reason every year to give them a certain subsidy, which of course is not well spent. Then you have to do that again. There are private companies that are producing sugar trying to compete. I think government should leave most of those companies. It does 2 things. It saves public money so that government can concentrate on the things it does best. The things that government does best is providing education and a platform for education. Universities are collapsing or unable to maintain themselves. Part of that is because they're not properly funded, and then there's not sufficient oversight for them to spend that money.
But Magoha said we're giving you 30% of the budget. What do you want, 50?
Well, no, I mean, okay, let's first start with the fact that there are too many, obviously. There's no reason to have a university in every county. There isn't a reason to have a university in every county. I think we should have universities that perform a role other than identity politics. Universities should be beyond that because they're institutions of learning. So that's one. You can expand infrastructure within universities in the sense that universities have very poor accommodation, they have no labs, the medical schools can be expanded and stuff like that. So there's places where government is the only institution that can do right that it must do. Cutting waste.
Yeah. Besides privatization, other things the government can focus on?
Of course, cutting waste. I mean, because as I said, if government privatizes, it means you're releasing new enterprises for people who can run them to do that. So that's one. Secondly is an FDI. We really need a policy that allows for more investment into this country, especially in manufacturing. I think taxes...
However, Kwame, allow me to interject. Foreign domestic investment has been really growing. If you look at the numbers from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, the number are increasing every day. Well,
it's pathetic. A country with a GDP of $80 billion, okay?
Yes.
Basically, our GDP is $80 billion. A foreign domestic investment of $1.8 billion is nothing. Dollars is nothing.
Okay.
We should be trying to chase as much as $10 billion in foreign direct investment. So what we have is from a low base, fine, it's growing, but it's so low to actually even have an effect. So that's one of the other things that's a problem.
How do we do that?
Well, more opening. Basically allow investors to come in here, and if they can take up through public investment, through privatization, the farms that are available, many successful farms, or many farms that could be run successfully and in government's hands. Thirdly, obviously, infrastructure investments. And I'm talking about more basic infrastructure. We don't have to grow big trains and all that. Of course, the fourth is just basically efficiency around the port. The Port of Kenya is one in which, well, it's done much better than it did, but obviously it could do much better if it was benchmarked. So for instance, the Port of Singapore allows for goods to be cleared within 4 hours.
4 hours?
Yes. A ship would come in, and those are huge, huge ships,
Yes.
and it would be cleared in 4 hours and is ready to leave. 4 hours. Big, big ships would be cleared in 4 hours. In our place, sometimes it takes more than a day. So that means we are 1/6 as efficient as the port of Singapore and Hong Kong are. Those can be done. Why? If it means new investments, if it means you need a partner in that port, yes, I think the politicization of that port has gone on for too long, and there are many, many people with an interest in that port, in that inefficiency, because it allows them to have some power. Those have to be cut. Finally, corruption. The Kenyan state will not meet its objectives under Vision 2030 and allow us to pass the baton to a third generation of Kenyans born after independence without fighting corruption decisively. And that starts within the public sector itself and in the executive branch of government. No cabinet secretaries whose departments are losing money should be allowed to sit in the cabinet. It's a painful thing, but I think the president has to make it. And it's more than making speeches at conferences. We must deal with people who are stealing public money. And unfortunately, they are known. They may be politically powerful, but they're known.
Yeah.
Without stopping that, we'll continue to have this flattering growth of 6% 1 year, and then you'll go back to 4, and we'll forever not be able to maintain a momentum that allows for sufficient jobs to be created and for this economy to become more efficient.
Well, like you've said, the president speaks, and he's spoken before. We've seen him wearing a velvet glove, warning his cabinet secretaries that whoever tries, they will face the music. Up until now, the iron fist is yet to strike. We take a short breather. When we come back, time for Social Watch, so we can sample some of the views that you have shared with us so far. Tonight, we are discussing the latest wave of layoffs in the country, and we'd like to know what you think about this topic. See you shortly. Hello there, my name is Ndiro Ganga. Did you enjoy this episode of Metropol Debrief? Well, click next to watch more. Also, remember to subscribe. The button is down below.